All right, thank you all for coming. Welcome to Medieval Joy. This is the first, I feel like this is, yes? Is this working? Yeah. This is the first of two events happening this weekend. You're invited as well to come to our event tomorrow at the Nordic Museum. There's more information about that at the end. So Medieval Joy is presented by the Medievalist Toolkit. This is an organization run by myself and my colleague, Dr. Kirsteiner, Professor Reich. And our purpose is to research and educate on the ways that the Middle Ages are used in the modern period. This is very broad. It encompasses a lot of things, and we'll see that reflected in presentations today from our fantastic undergrad researchers. So this conference is giving a chance to our undergraduates to present the work that they have done in classes with us, looking into the ways that people use and reimagine the Middle Ages in different periods, the way that they politicize them, and bring them into pop culture even. So with that, and also, we have today as expert respondents the Executive Board of Costumers of Color, Gigi Colson, Jess Van Hattem, excuse me, and oh my gosh, Anela Abdurrahman. And Costumers of Color is a nonprofit organization that advocates for seeing people of color in the past. They work with us a little bit and hopefully more in the future. We are really happy to have them giving perspective to our student presenters today on using history and research and presenting it to a public audience. So the way that this is going to go is we'll have each student present kind of in one block. And then we're doing things a little bit differently. Rather than having a big group question and answer period, we're actually going to break up into smaller groups. So keep an eye out for a presentation that you'd really like to talk to the presenter from. We found that when people are in these sort of smaller groups, they get a chance to actually get real feedback. People get very intimidated about raising their hand and asking a question. So the way we're having it, it's more of a direct conversation. So we'll go through the presentations and then break up into groups with each of the presenters and get their, you can give them feedback, ask them questions. And with that, I think we're gonna start. So our first presenter is Zoe Valdez-Gonzalez, who is an SU freshman, so please give her a big round of applause. Whatever feels comfortable to you.
Probably not.
All right, can we still, is it still gonna record without the mic audio? We're gonna be okay? Okay.
Okay. So as you guys know, I'm a freshman here at SU. Wanted to apologize in advance because I have not done, looked back at this slide since fall quarter. So I gotta refresh my mind a little bit, but just bear with me. Okay, I promise I kind of know what I'm talking about. So whenever we were given the topic of like comparing modern times to medieval times, it was really difficult for me to like think of something because it was so open and so broad, and I was like, great, what am I gonna think about? But then it was around the time when like the live action of The Little Mermaid came out, and like there was the big controversy and all that crazy stuff that was going on, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is like perfect right now. So I decided to pick the concept of race and how it was perceived in medieval times. And then here on the cover, I wanted to pick fresco painting, which those were used in medieval times, and they were mainly used to show the like racial hierarchy that they had, the Spaniards had, and they made it like very obvious, like who was the Spaniard and who were Mexicans or who were just any person of color, and they tried showing like what I guess like the generations would look like if you mixed both races, because SMU like Europeans were seen as like higher than anybody else. But yeah, so that's kind of a gist of what I'm going to talk about. Yeah, so this is a little table of contents, being like the project question that I came up with. Then we're going to see a little bit of modern perception, and then how that can tie into medieval times, and then at the end is the conclusion to see if my question was answered at the end. Yes, so like I said, a little like overview. Race is, as we know, it's more of a social construct than like an actual like the definition of an actual thing. And it was mainly used to like group people into like different like little groups based on their skin color and their facial features. And then once I was doing my research, I realized that the thing of race thinking like also came up, which was also like a way of showing like the superior race and all that fun stuff. Not fun stuff, but you know what I mean. So like I said, the controversy of the Little Mermaid live action was what really like kind of intrigued me into getting into this topic. And then that was also around the time where the Victoria's Secret fashion show was like on, and I realized that there was this kind of like trend, and I was kind of confused because I was like, okay, we're supposed to be in modern times, we're supposed to be very inclusive, all this and that, but it's not showing it in like broad media, right? So I decided to come up with a question of, does race affect the way women are perceived, and can that be rooted back to medieval times? So for the modern perspective, I realized that in the Victoria's Secret show, they did include women of color, but the majority of them were light skinned. There was only, from what I could see, on like, because I did research on like all the models like that were on the show, there was around like 2 or 3 that were like actually like darker complexion. I'm not saying the other ones are not maybe like from black race or anything, but I'm saying like based on what the company was showing us, it was mainly just like light-skinned women or girls who do like self-tan. And I was like, okay. And then so I kind of tied this to a survey that was done in Black Americans in the 80s, I want to say. And they basically just asked them like, what do you think is more attractive, or how do you think women are attractive, this and that. And so there was a really high response saying that light-skinned women tend to be more attractive because they have more feminine features. And that's kind of what stuck with me the most out of the entire survey, because I was like, who is to determine that that's the only like beautiful part of being dark-skinned? Or who is to determine that they have more feminine features based on the color of their skin? Like, I wasn't able to connect dots to that. And then this quote at the end, like towards the end of the article, really stood out to me the most, because it basically talks about how we're not able to change our like beauty standards in society and all that if we still have the Eurocentric standards that we had back in the days. So as long as we don't like do something with the beauty standards that we have in society, we're not going to be able to change each person. So I did a lot of research, or I got more for like medieval times, and it was mainly like stories or authors and novels and all of that. And so I noticed a few things here and there that were pretty common in most of the research I've done. And one being that religion was a really, really big deal, more than it is nowadays, and how Christianity was like the dominant religion. So, and then how they were able to tie Christianity with purity, which was something that was actually talked about in this course a lot. We were giving a lot of readings about like, why does Christianity like have to signify purity when there's other types of religions that, you know, weren't as seen as much. And then, so that also kind of ties with the second topic, being that, that the religion was more superior, which they also tied it with the skin color, being like, if you're fair-skinned, you have a pure Christian soul. And there was a really interesting novel where it talked about this like white, like fair-skinned princess queen, and she falls in love with this Muslim, like, dark-skinned man, and they have a baby. That baby was, like, it literally described it as a blob with, like no, like, human, like, facial features whatsoever. And then they said that they converted the man into a Christian man, and he became white, and the baby became an actual human baby. So that was really uncomfortable reading, but also it definitely showed me how, like, wow, so they really thought that if you were Christian, one, you had to be white, or it was mainly white, and two, you were, like, the ultimate, like, person out there. And then this also goes into how it was dangerous to mix, like, races, like, because you're going from, like, a pure, like, European, and you're, like, messing up your bloodline, basically. So it's kind of like a warning. And then that was contrasted with the way that, like, women of color were over-sexualized. So you could, it was very obvious, the comparison between both of them, how, like, most adjectives that were used for women with, like, fair skin were like, oh, she's beautiful, she's delicate. And then for women of dark skin, they were like, oh, she's vulgar, and she's, like, some really vulgar words that really, I guess, showed the contrast. And there was a lot of novels that over-sexualize them, and then even just, like, objectify them in general, not even, like, see them as women. They were like, they even, like, fetishize them, and they were like, oh, like, she's only made for desire, and, like, men are only gonna want her, like, men are only gonna want her because of her body. And so I think that's something, or that's a common thing that we see nowadays as well with women of color, how there are a lot of people focus more on their body, and, like, a lot of, like, big companies also use that as well against them, which they think they're being like, oh no, we're being inclusive, but, like, not really if you're following, like, European standards. And there was, I didn't add this on slide, but there was one story that talked about a Muslim woman, and they said that her job was sleeping around with men, and that's basically what the entire story talked about, was just how her, like, hobby would be to sleep around with men, and to, like, be very, like, just not pure. Yeah, so it was very obvious how they were perceived very differently. And then these were just some, like, adjectives that I saw that depicted a woman of color in those readings, which would be sexually desirable, unloyal, not holy, not beautiful, just objectifying them. They obviously not Christian because they thought they were the superior religion. But yeah, these are some things that I think nowadays we can even see that it's, like, still happening, even though we're, like, years from that. But, and then to conclude, I was able to answer my question that yes, women of color are perceived differently even since medieval times, and this is based on like I said before, the Eurocentric beauty standards that are still implied nowadays, and then this, I feel like, is the reason why a lot of us women still have difficulty with, like, our self-esteem and, like, the way we are seen in society. Like, and then something that came to mind was the skin whitening creams, how that's, like, advertised a lot, how it's like, oh, like, especially, I have a lot of friends who are, like, part of are Asian, and they said that their families kind of, like, push that onto them, like, oh, you're too dark, like, you need to, like, get, like the papaya cream stuff, and so that's something that, like I said, I see nowadays too, and I'm like, wow, that's crazy that even in, like, medieval times, like, they would talk about it, and nowadays we still do. And then, yeah, basically how this leads to less opportunities, as we see with, like, the Little Mermaid stuff, how even though she was given this really great role, there was still controversy, but, like, why is that mermaid dark skin? Guys, it's a mermaid. It makes you real. And so this is why like I said earlier, like, the self-esteem part and, like, women who are lighter versus women who have darker skin can be a little different, as their skin can, like, not by everyone obviously, but obviously by some people it's still seen as, like, oh, well, you're too dark, so you're not as pretty. And yes, we're of, I guess, kind of trying to find a way or a balance between not being, not trying to be like insensitive, because there's a lot of companies that try to do that, but also like still being inclusive. It's kind of like this thin line that I think we're still kind of trying to find the balance between. And that's it.
We'll do the next one.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you so much.
They're all in order, so just the next one.
Presenter, this one, is Tung. Now, see, I do not know how to present your last name correctly, which is Tung Nguyen. Almost?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's that's a student of mine who took a seminar with me and did really great work on Christian-Muslim relations in the Middle Ages. Tung is a sophomore and a major in political science.
Political science and economics.
Economics and economics. So we look very forward to your presentation.
Thank you.
I am just gonna sneak back
Oh, sorry.
under here.
This is not the easiest way.
Sorry, that's good. Okay, so the floor is open to you.
Thank you. In recent years, a lot of politicians have used medieval symbols in their speeches, especially among anti-Muslim and anti-migration politicians. In Europe and America, politicians talk about how Muslim immigrants are performing a jihad or a holy war against the Western nations. A lot of them propose that they need to do a crusade against Muslim nations, as seen during George Bush intervention in the Middle East in Iraq. In fact, for many decades, people have used medieval symbolism in order to represent Muslim and Christian relationship. They pitch both sides as mortal enemies, as people who cannot coexist with each other, who have been always fighting against one another for centuries. But is this true? In my presentation, I will look at the Christian and Muslim relationship in the medieval ages in order to see how this narrative is not only false, but harmful for both Christian and Muslims around the world. So, medieval symbols have been used and taken by far-right movements as a way to unite them, or as a way to create a narrative. This picture shows the relatively recent Unite the Right rally in 2017, where a lot of far-right groups protested in Washington, D.C. And so, if we were to look at this shield specifically, it's actually a medieval symbol. It is the symbol of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Crusader states in the Middle East, which participated in the Crusades. In fact, even the Ku Klux Klan have used medieval symbolism in their organization, as they refer to themselves as knights. And so we see that throughout the years, a lot of right-wing and far-right movements have used medieval symbolism and as a way to justify their opinions, as a way to say that this has always been the truth, and what they're saying is something that has already existed. In fact, a more recent example would be the Secretary of Defense, Hexed, I think that's his last name, who has been seen with a tattoo on his arm of the phrase Deus vult, which is Latin for God wills it, and also has the same symbol on the shield on his bicep, not his bicep, on his chest. And so even nowadays, medieval symbols are being used by politicians, by organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan, as a way to create a certain story about the past and help justify their opinion. And so they use these symbols as a way to push anti-Muslim and anti-migration and anti-immigration policies, and push this story of white supremacy as well. But if we were to look at medieval history, we would see that in many cases, Christians and Muslims did cooperate with each other. They were not mostly religiously or ideologically driven, but rather were driven by strategic and geopolitical interests. So here we have a peace treaty between the city-state of Genoa, which is located in modern-day Italy, and the Emirate of Majorca, which is situated in modern-day Spain. This peace treaty has been translated by Professor Kernsteiner and details the peace treaty between the monarch, I'm sorry if I butchered his name, Abdallah ibn Ghania, son of Ishaq, and the ambassador of Genoa, Nicola Lecanose, in the name of the archbishop, the consuls, and the wise men of Genoa. And so this is solid proof that even back in the medieval ages, the Middle Ages, both Muslims and Christian countries performed diplomacy with one and another. Furthermore, this treaty details cooperation between these two states, as if we were to look at this yellow text, we can see that, and if any Genoese go to Garbo or Spain, or maybe they return from there, they must give any custom tolls, but they will be promised to be protected within the lands of Abdullah ibn Ghania, and they are also promised to be provided lodging, housing, if they want, where they want it. They are provided food in forms of a bakery, a bath once per week, on whichever day they like, and without any duty applying this, so they can not take the bath if they want. And they also are provided a church where they are able to pray and tend to their religious needs. And so we see that not only does this treaty shows cooperation between the Muslims and the Christian states, it also shows that they were able to give good treatment to each other, since the Muslim countries, the Muslim emirate is willing and they want to provide housing and somewhere for the Genoese to pray in. Of course, this is not a one-sided treaty, as the Genoese have agreed to protect his country, the emirate, and to not help any of his enemies, as seen in the green text. That these are the things that Nicola agreed to for himself and the archbishop, the consuls of Genoa, and all Genoese people. The Genoese must not cause any harm or damage to the people of Abdallah ibn Ghani on their land, and they must not help the enemies of Abdallah ibn Ghani, not for deeds, words, people, or money. So this is a mutually beneficial relationship. The emirate provides the Genoese with a land where they can rest and do trade in, which since Genoa was a city-state and was very interested in trade, they wanted this agreement. And in return, Genoa would provide protection to the emirate and make sure that they do not do any harm to the people of this state. Of course, during this time, the emirate was under threat of being invaded by other Muslim rulers in modern day Spain, and Genoa was a very powerful and rich country at this time, so there might be power imbalance as the emirate was much more reliant on the Genoese protection. But this still shows that Muslims and Christian rulers were more than willing to do diplomacy with each other and provide each other with their needs, even with the difference in religion. And an interesting fact about this treaty in particular, it's a bit hard to read here, but the treaty was made in 1188, which was a year before the Third Crusade, where Genoa provided military and economic assistance to the Crusaders in trying to retake Jerusalem. So even when in the middle of the Crusades, which are seen as the most intense period of Muslim and Christian conflicts, Christians and Muslims still continue to do trade with each other, they still did diplomacy with each other, and they still agreed to protect one another if it's mutually beneficial. And so we show that, this shows that the people of the medieval age were not irrational, they were not only driven by their own, by their beliefs, but they were very rational. Their decisions were based on strategic interests, economic interests, and political interests. In fact, in Muslim ruled Spain, which was called Al-Andalus, Muslims and Christians lived side by side, as Spain was a majority Christian region at that time, or the Iberian Peninsula, because we include Portugal. And during this time, the Muslims did provide social movement for both Jewish and Christian people, even though they ruled over these people. Jewish people were able to gain important positions, such as a diplomat, as seen with the Jewish diplomat Hasdai ibn Shaprut, and they had a relative religious tolerance during that time. During that time, the Muslims did not they did not force Christians or the Jews to convert. Though it is important that discrimination still existed, this was not just a time of peace, as Christians and Jews had to pay extra taxes in forms of the jizya, a type of taxation that was levied on non-Muslim subjects. And so we see how the relationship between Muslims and Christians is not one-dimensional, it is very complex. Well, in Al-Andalus, there was an opportunity for Muslims and Jews to move socially and to have freedom. They also suffered discrimination through taxes. Furthermore, the Muslims ruler contributed to Spanish cultural development and Portuguese cultural development, as they built a lot of palaces. They provided knowledge from the Muslim world, which was in a golden age at that time, as seen with this palace, which is the Alhambra, located in modern-day southern Spain. This palace is built with a very Muslim style architecture, very different from the Christian style that existed in Spain. And nowadays, if you were to learn about Spanish history and culture, you will see a lot of influence of Muslims during this time. And so there's Muslims not only just conquered Spain, but they also helped. They were also a very pivotal force for Spanish history and cultural development during this time. Of course, there was not only peace and cooperations between Muslims. The Crusades did exist. Muslims and Christians did fight in the Holy War together. The Christians did a crusade in the Middle East, and the Muslims responded with a jihad. So, of course, Christians and Muslims did fight with each other, and there are many instances of injustice committed by one side to the other. One example would be found in Spain as well as after the Reconquista, which is the Spanish reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, or the Portuguese and the Spanish reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula. The Spanish monarchy decided to force the Muslim and Jewish population still living in this land to either be convert to Christianity or be kicked out. And so this shows that there were instances where violence and discrimination did exist, where injustice had happened to minorities. And so but this shows that it's not only one side or the other. The medieval ages was a very long period with many different instances where cooperation happened, but also injustices and war. And so we should not look at it through just one lens, through one narrative, which have been pushed by a lot of people, including far-right groups. As such, if there was one thing that I would want everybody to take from this presentation, is that the people of the medieval ages did not act in just religious or ideological belief. They did not do irrational acts. All the actions were both injustices and cooperation were done out of rational thought. They thought of the benefits and the disadvantages, and they committed the actions that they did. It's, a lot of the medieval ages was based on the relationship of strategic interests and economic interests as well. And so, if in this modern day and age where politicians try to create a certain narrative and use history in order to further this narrative, I think that it's important for us as citizens, but also as students, to look at the source ourselves, to learn more about what they're using, about the history they're using, and be able to see that no, what the narrative you're pushing is one-sided. It doesn't take the full picture, and you're trying to lie to me, and I think it's very important, especially with the rise of very hateful rhetorics among certain individuals. Thank you for listening to my presentation.
Thank you so much, Dong, for a fabulous presentation. I can hardly speak as well myself, and the same to you. Our next presenter is Carter Curry. He is a junior at Union College, and I look very forward that he joined us to Seattle University here, and will tell us about Viking shield maidens between fact and fiction. Carter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for welcoming me here to Seattle University. It's so nice to be able to get out of upstate New York sometimes. It's quite dreary sometimes. So I definitely appreciate the opportunity you all have given to me. As you know, I go to Union College in Schenectady, New York. I'm also an economics major, but today I'm going to be talking to you guys about some Viking history, which is a little bit more exciting. And today I'm going to talk to you guys about Viking shield maidens, actually, and how they exist between the realms of fact and fiction, and sort of this liminal space between legend and history. So when I say the word shield maiden, or maybe Viking woman, you perhaps picture one of these two different images in your mind. On one hand, you have sort of the dominant narrative about Viking women in modern media, which is sort of this idea of a militant woman, perhaps like a berserker. If you are a fan of the Assassin's Creed video games, this would be a character that you would see, kind of just dual wielding axes, giving a battle cry, and just like looking very fierce. And this wouldn't exactly be entirely historically correct. On the other hand, here's a photo from a modern day reenactment of Viking women and how she would sort of look like had she been alive today. And this view would sort of see a Viking woman being more of a craftswoman, or someone who is very important and devoted to the goings-on in the household. So the reason why neither of these narratives is truly, the correct or the dominant narrative that we go with, and why it's so ambiguous, is because the Viking period itself, many people do not know, was actually quite an ambiguous period itself. It spans over 300 years, from 793 CE, where the first instance of the word Viking is used in historical texts. And many people also do not know that the word Viking also refers not only to the warriors who would perform raids, but also to Scandinavian farmers and also merchants who would come to the south for better agriculture and trading opportunities. So they were not all fighters, actually. And in 1066, the Viking period comes to a close, and this is actually due to the Christianization of Northern Europe. As many people know, the Viking culture was not a Christian culture. It was a Norse pagan culture. And when the Christian religion was introduced to Northern Europe, it became less acceptable for Vikings to perform raids on other areas in Western Europe as they become more integrated with the more dominant Christian culture of the time. However, it was not until another 200 years or 150 years passed that we actually have written records, written historical records of Viking history. And that is because in the Viking culture, they did not have a large, they did not have really a tradition of written history. They more relied on an oral tradition, and this was performed by the Viking skalds, who were, you could say, the professional storytellers of the culture, and their job was to memorize history and legends, but also they had an important role in day-to-day life, which was, memorizing laws for civil suits. Finally, fast forward to today, or the relatively recent history. In the early 2010s, we began to narrow in on Vikings in our media, and this sort of the Viking obsession began to appear around 2013 when the television show Vikings came out. And these modern Viking medias often show Viking women in the light that you saw earlier, where they are very present on the battlefield. So not only is the role of Viking women hard to define because of the different periods throughout the Viking Age, but also as you can see, the presence of the Viking people and the Viking culture was actually quite expansive over space. As you can see, all of these red areas is places where the Viking people had major settlements, and all the green areas is places where they would conduct raids. And it's quite difficult to make blanket statements about Viking women because different Viking settlements would have different outlooks on the role of Viking women in their society. So we see Viking settlements all the way east in Russia, and as many of you know, Viking explorers sailed all the way out to North America in what is now Newfoundland and Canada. They called it Finland. And as we move west, we see the role of Viking women becoming more and more focused on martial attributes because sort of the situations that they were in were getting more and more difficult and further away from civilized or settled society. They were some of the first explorers of Iceland, Greenland, and Newfoundland, and it would be more expected of the women to be able to fend for themselves in these new lands, and it wouldn't be uncommon for them to be able to utilize different weapons and also tools. Many people do not know that Leif Erikson actually had a sister named Freydis, and she is described in some texts as a shield maiden or as sort of a martial woman. So what do we actually know about Viking women through archaeology and through scholarly study? Well, we do know that while Viking society could be described as patriarchal, there was also different and more important aspects of your identity, which would be more important to how you were viewed in society, such as your social class. Men and women of the highest social class actually were very respected members of society, and they did have a lot of different opportunities, whether they wanted to become politicians or warriors. So if you were a woman of a higher class in the Viking Age, you might actually have an opportunity to be a soldier or something similar if that was your heart's desire. But in general, going to all women of the Viking Age, not just the upper class ones, Viking women led very hard and labor-filled lives, and this is because they were often described as the mistresses of the household. So that means they were not only tasked with things that we see as traditionally feminine household jobs, but they were also tasked with all duties of the household. So that also includes things that we see as very masculine today. So the chopping of the wood, or using a bow and arrow to go out and hunt animals. And the women of the higher class were also tasked with organizing all of the different servants around the quarters as well. So they were entrusted with a lot of responsibility and were very respected in their society. Also, many people do not know that there's this traditional view of Viking raiding parties being predominantly men, and they would sail off to different lands and storm different locations to acquire resources. But as I talked about earlier, some of these parties were merchants or farmers, and even the martial groups would bring along women and children. And if these women who traveled to new lands, as I discussed earlier, were often expected to be able to fend for themselves or use different tools and weapons. So transitioning now on to what we know from legends, and this is from sources which are around 200 years or 200 years past the sort of the last Vikings, and this is recorded by Christian historians. I predominantly studied the Gesta Danorum, or the Deeds of the Danes, otherwise known as the 9 books of Danish history by Saxo Grammaticus in my research. And I found that in this recording of myth and legend and also history, that there was actually mention of, fierce warrior women. However, that does come with certain caveats, given that this was a history recorded by members of a non-Viking culture. Through my research, I was able to find that 83% of the characters in this history were male, and the other 17% of characters who were female were often depicted as important politicians and also warriors, and sometimes, often they were seen as villains, as we'll get into later. So the way that I found out, the fact that 83% of the characters in this history were male is I did data analysis, which is actually not that common in the humanities, but with Professor Kiersteiner's help, I was able to use data analysis techniques that you'd see in more sciencey subjects and apply it to the humanities. So I created a table of the names, the genders, and the occupations of all 363 characters within the 9 books of Danish history, which was quite a large task. And I found out that the spread of occupations looks something like this crazy diagrams. Given that there's 363 characters, there are a lot of different jobs that people would have. However, the most interesting part of this is the idea that the most talked about, this big red pizza slice right here, this is the group of people who I identified as kings. And the reason why I think this is so interesting is because kings obviously made up a very small portion of the population. However, the Christian historians who went back and recorded these Viking histories were very obsessed with the line of succession. So you could sort of think of these histories as the Viking equivalent of Game of Thrones. It's just one king being deposed by another king again and again and again, just following the cycle of succession and the wars that came with it. And that is because this history was recorded by a very interesting historian, a man named Saxo Grammaticus. And what we know about him today is he was a very learned and devoted scholar, but he was not quite the most reliable narrator because he was obsessed with masculinity and obsessed with war and all of these different, macho concepts. He was a Danish Christian monk, and here we can see him describing one of his female characters in the Gesta Danorum, describing her as an Amazon and also fighting like a man would and not really giving her due credit. And I believe the language used by Saxo is a result of an implicit bias that he might have had as a Christian historian. Perhaps the idea of martial women participating and martial roles was a sort of a cultural taboo. And evidence I found of this was the female soldiers in these books, without without a doubt, would often end up murdering their husbands. And I believe that this was a sort of nod by Saxo, or a warning to say, do not participate in marriage with a woman who is also a soldier. They are typically depicted as very cruel, violent, again, separated from their humanity. They're described as Amazons, which some of you may know is derived from the Latin or classical Latin idea of these mythical warrior women who are often extremely violent and would like hunt men for sport or something crazy like that. And also, all of these women meet their end in combat by a male warrior, and they earn a lot of honor, and often go on to become the next king in the line of succession after their battles with these terrible female warrior villains. So I believe all these patterns are evidence of perhaps a skewing of the narrative by Saxo. But let's look at some of the names and the roles of some of the women that he included in his histories. First, we have Lagertha, and this was the inspiration. The Gesta Danorum's depiction of this figure was the inspiration for the character of the same name in the 2013 show Vikings. And in the show, she is depicted as a great warrior, but also very beautiful and feminine. And this is perhaps a nod to how she is described in the Gesta Danorum as having this flowing hair. Next, we have Rusla. She's known as the Red Maiden because in the Gesta Danorum and also the Irish Annals, which is perhaps evidence that this figure was quite famous, as she's cross-referenced in different histories. She was depicted as going onto merchant vessels or different vessels, pretending to be an innocent maiden, and then she would use her martial skills to then kill the whole crew through her deception. She is also depicted as having a close relationship with another warrior woman named Stikla, and this is perhaps, it's not explicitly mentioned in the text, but this is perhaps evidence of a romantic relationship between two women during this period. Finally, we have the Princess Sela, who is the sister of a great warrior, who then has a disagreement with her brother and is then killed. Very little is known about this figure, but what is known is that she was very skilled. Even Saxo, the masculinity-obsessed historian, described her as a skilled pirate, and I thought that was very interesting. So, finally, after all this discussion of myth and legend, I want to discuss some real archaeological evidence that Viking women perhaps participated in warfare. In 1878, there was a grave in Birka, Sweden. It was one of the most well-preserved graves of a warrior buried with full honors. There was spears, bows, armor, shields, everything. It was just assumed to be a man for over 100 years. But in 2017, something interesting happened where scientists performed a DNA test on the skeletal remains of the person buried, and what they found was that this person was actually a woman. And this is the first instance of a Viking grave like this being identified as a woman. However, we haven't done DNA testing on every Viking burial site that we know, so there are perhaps hundreds or more graves that have yet to be analyzed in this way. However, I think ultimately figures such as the woman buried here in Birka were rare, and the fact that she was buried with weapons does not technically denote that she was a warrior. She could have just been a very honored member of her society. But the important takeaway I want to leave you all with is that there is not, with medieval times, there is not just one narrative with different groups of people, which we've seen in other presentations today, such as people of color or Christians and Muslims and how they would interact. There is very varied, there's as much diversity as there are with people today, and it is not necessarily dependent on, your actions in life are not necessarily dependent on your identity. However, there are some people in the world today who want to look back on medieval times and use it as an argument that society was once, women were subservient to men, and we should go back to these times. But in reality, this is just not true. As we can see here, there is a real grave of a woman buried with weapons, and she could have perhaps been a warrior. So, thank you very much. That's the end.
Thank you so much, Carter, for a fantastic presentation. I myself learn new things each time I hear them, so thank you. This is great. Our next speaker is Emily Rosehan. She is a sophomore at Union College. She already ran 10K this morning, just saying. And she is a history major. Yay. And she's talking to us today about racist neo-paganism and its connections to Norse paganism. Emily, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, so I'm Emily, and I'll be talking about, as first Sarah said, racist neo-paganism and its connections to Norse paganism. So to begin, in recent years, there have been a number of mass shootings, and not surprisingly, the culprits are often affiliated with extremist ideologies. Perhaps more surprisingly, though, is their affiliation with medieval extremist ideologies. For example, in 2011, Anders Breivik, who's featured here, committed a mass killing, and it was later unearthed that his gun was named after the Norse god Odin's spear Gungnir. And in 2017, at the Unite the Right protest, protesters carried flags with Thor's hammer emblazoned across them. Again, in 2019, the New Zealand terrorist wrote "See you in Valhalla," which is the Norse afterlife, at the end of his manifesto. And similarly, in 2022, a Buffalo shooter wrote the same phrase at the end of his manifesto. And this specific shooter's manifesto also featured the Sonnenrad, which had Germanic runes and was also used by Hitler. On a similar note, there was a self-proclaimed human shaman at the Capitol riot who had tattoos of Norse mythology all over him. And so this presentation is going to look at Norse paganism and its misuse in modern contexts. So, kind of some background on the rise of neo-paganism. The pagan religion, and by its connection witchcraft, was forced underground due to witch hunts and other laws, but all of these sanctions were lifted in the 1900s, and so we see the rise of neo-paganism and Wicca. And once these sanctions were lifted, Wicca and paganism was kind of brought back to life. So typically witches, as they proclaim themselves, engage in rituals such as sabbats, esbats, rites of passage, and magic. Notably, most witches are women, with 64% of them identifying as female, and 28% of neo-pagans as a whole identify as bisexual, and 11% identify as homosexual, which indicates a big connection and tie to the LGBTQ community. In addition, in the 1960s and 70s, witchcraft was a women's movement, and in the rise of the feminist movement. So we can see here that there is this obvious leftist connection with neo-paganism. However, while Wicca and goddess paganism are extremely left-leaning, there is a wide range of beliefs in the neo-pagan community. One of these beliefs is Odinism. Odinists are a sect of neo-paganisms that venerate Old Norse and Germanic warrior gods and fertility goddesses. And while most Odinists in America are not neo-Nazis, it is important to examine these extremist groups to understand the origins of their hate. So in order to do this, it's important to look back at the start of racist neo-paganism. This can be traced back to a woman named Elise Christensen, who is also referred to as the grandmother of racial paganism. She comes from Florida, and she created the Odinist Fellowship in 1969. This is the oldest organization in the Norse pagan scene, and her beliefs have some key points. One, she thought the connection to Odinism was biological, therefore only Northern Europeans could claim it. And she also thought the solution to cultural demise that we see nowadays, as she believes, was the revival of Norse paganism. In 1971, she published the Odinist Fellowship, which is a newspaper that contained a carefully veiled racialist pagan message. And in her publication, she did argue in support of Hitler. She also argues for anarchy and connects this concept to the Odinist concept of tribal socialism, where there would be small, cooperative, intentional communities of pagans that could then serve as springboards for meaningful activism. And so we can see here Christensen is advocating for Odinism in a political way and did not actually use any violence in her efforts. But other examples of Odinism will go much further into violent extremism. One of these examples is Wyatt Kaldenberg and the Odinist Cult of Violence. This was started in the 1990s. And as some background on Kaldenberg, he, when he was younger, learned about the Black separatist creed of the Nation of Islam, which inspired him to form a racial religion of his own. And he looked at books about pre-Christian European mythology at the library. He then started publishing the Pagan Revival in the early 1990s. And the point of this publication was to blatantly state racist pagan ideas that Christensen had kind of shied away from or more carefully veiled for publication. He believed in something called Manichaean paganism, or the belief that there is a continuous struggle between the Aryan children of the sun and the demonic followers of the demiurge Yahweh. To this point, Kaldenberg preached that when Aryans practiced paganism, we were in the Golden Age, and once Judeo-Christianity took over, civilization is now in the Dark Age. So obviously he is extremely anti-Semitic, and he believes that Jews are the agents of this demiurge. For this reason, he fully supports the Holocaust and actually thought it should have occurred sooner. And he also has a hatred for Holocaust deniers, and believes that human history is a chain of holocausts, and also accuses the Jews of murdering 300 million European pagans during 2,000 years of Jewish Christianity. In addition, Kaldenberg wants to establish Odinist enterprises to finance daycare centers, free clinic schools, and paramilitary defense units that would patrol white communities. So, like Christensen, Kaldenberg expresses mainly political views and this violent extremism, but does not really engage in the ritual aspects of paganism. And then another example that we see with this violent extremism is David Lane, who also expresses these neo-Nazi beliefs. Lane started studying religious subjects and Odinism while he was in prison, and he came to believe that Christianity was the cause of the decay of Aryan culture and the rise of globalist society. Like other neo-Nazis, he believed in the Jewish conspiracy to establish global tyranny, and he reinterpreted the whole of American history in the context of a Zionist conspiracy, and said that America was formed with 222-year Jewish Kabbalistic timetable to destroy every race, nation, and culture in pursuit of the Jew world order. And he also came up with Wotan, which stands for Will of the Aryan Nation, and this is a kind of paramilitary army. And this military underground group's goal was to operate independently and commit individual acts of violence, which is kind of a lone wolf mentality. And this actually inspired the warrior complex of man who committed the OKC bombing in the late 1990s. Lane also created 14 words as a rallying call for a pan-Aryan militant uprising, which is now a universal reference in many books and web pages. So this 1488 signature means his 14 words and then Hail Hitler. And he also created the Temple of Wotan, which means Odin in Germanic. And with the help of his wife, he was able to publish books, pamphlets, and a webpage spreading his beliefs, and create the Temple of Wotan, which is legally recognized. So another sect of Odinism is known as Asatruism, and this stresses the blood relation of people to Northern European ancestors. And this is kind of seen as a third position between anti-racism and militant racism. It's typically depicted as less extreme than other forms of Odinism, and Asatruists believe that gods and goddesses are similar to man and that there is a kinship between them. They see Northern Europeans as the children of Odin, therefore they are the only ones that can practice Odinism. Stephen McNallen started the Asatru Folk Assembly in 1976, and Valverde Murray launched the Asatru Alliance shortly after. McNallen actually announced an end to tolerance for Nazi involvement in the Norse pagan scene and tried to remove National Socialists and other race political extremists from the organization. So this is why Kaldenberg separated from this organization. And in 2000, the group claimed to have more than 50 kindreds across the United States and Canada. Notably, there are Asatruists who claim to be anti-racist and say that any ethnic background can embrace Asatruism. However, these people are referred to as race traitors by racist Asatruists. And none of the aforementioned Odinist or Asatruist groups practice pagan rituals, magic, or rites, and instead choose to focus on the political side of the religions. Which brings me to Odinism and pagan rites, rituals, and magic. So there are groups within Odinism who do practice these rituals and magic, and one example of this was the Order, which was created by Robert J. Matthews in 1983. It consisted of 9 militant young men, including David Lane, and it was intended to be an Aryan revolutionary underground. In order for one to be initiated into the order, the men underwent a pagan initiation ritual in which they stood within a circle of lighted candles, washed over by a portrait of Adolf Hitler, and with a 6-week-old female baby placed in a blanket at the center. The men clasped hands, repeating the high-flown words recited by Matthews. So this ritual was intended to summon the forces of Norse gods and goddesses, and the infant would symbolize the new golden age being born. Matthews is remembered as an Aryan warrior martyr due to his refusal to lay down his weapons when his house was burned down by the FBI due to his numerous crimes. December 8th, 1984 became the Day of Martyrs to commemorate him, and so the sentiments of the Norse warrior continue in these circles. Similarly, Ron McBain introduced numerous rituals into the Wotensvoke Creed Vote. This is a separate sect from the Wotensvoke. The Wotensvoke Creed attempted to draw on pre-Christian Aryan traditions and Norse ceremonial traditions. So these would include both communal and individual rites. For example, communal ceremonies could be about seasonal bloods, rites of passage, daily invocations, rune casting, and magic. And Matthews used quotes from Havamal from the Poetic Edda to recruit people to his cause. One rite is of particular significance. The term Einarhar is a Norse term for the brave warriors who died in battle and were brought to Valhalla, which was the abode of Odin. And in the Wotansvok Creed, these people are seen as racial warriors who were willing to die in order to protect their Aryan homeland. And a rite of passage would take place for them, in which everyone is dressed in Viking attire. The initiate wears a Norse symbol of the Valknut, and the leader of the ceremony says to open the gates of Valhalla. The initiate is then given the blessings of Odin. And many Odinists glorify this image of the white male Norse warrior, and they use the Vikings, the Norse gods, to justify their own violent and harmful ideology. So kind of to like look at where these Odinists are actually getting some of their ideas, a lot of it is just circulated within these circles. As I said, some of these people would publish their own books and these would get read, but they do also look back at some primary sources. I found this information on the Odinist Fellowship UK website, which is this temple in Newark, London. So some of the sources they would use are the Eddas, and these are most important for Odinist beliefs. They were composed in 13th century Iceland, and there are two. One is called the Younger Edda, and it was composed by Snorri Sturluson in order to keep the traditional Icelandic style of poetry alive. In the poems, he uses metaphors and allusions to old heathen myths. The second Edda is the Elder Edda. This was an anonymous collection of Odinist poetry, and it has texts like the Havamal, which I previously mentioned, which means the sayings of the High One, and Voluspa, which means the Sirius's prophecy. These texts could potentially go back to the 9th century. The meaning in the Elder Edda is a lot more obscure, but Odinists believe it could convey the true mood of the elder heathen faith a lot better. Typically, newer Odinists are referred to the Younger Edda, and more experienced are referred to the Elder One. And then in addition to this, they also use English, Norwegian, and Icelandic rune poems, and some work by Saxo Grammaticus. And then to tie this back to actual Norse traditions, we have evidence from the Middle Ages that Norse people contradicted traditional gender roles. Although Odin was a powerful god who required good warriors for his afterlife Valhalla, there were other aspects of him that Odinists failed to address. As Odin was the master practitioner of magic, he would sometimes shapeshift if he thought this would get him an advantage. This could even mean turning into a woman. However, when males practice magic, it attracts ergi, which is essentially effeminacy or even gender bending. Ergi is also tied up with some of the strongest taboos in Viking Age society surrounding homosexuality, incest, and gender roles. Because of the stigma and social taboos surrounding ergi, men who practice magic risk deep dishonor. So, in fact, even the accusation of ergi could harm a man's honor. The concept of ergi being a gender-bending phenomenon is completely contradictory to Odinist view of Norse paganism. They see the ideal warrior as a white straight male, like Matthews was, or like the Einarhars. Furthermore, many in the Wotansvok Creed practice this magic, which, according to Nordic people, could cause ergi. And so, obviously, they are not aware that this could cause that, and they do not know of its background. And so, again, we can kind of see how these neo-Nazis and racist Odinists used Norse history as a means to express their hateful beliefs when they do not even know all of it and are just using it as a way to promote their extremely harmful and violent ideology. And that's it in my presentation. And my sources.
Our final presenter is Stephen Nelson, who is a senior history major at SU. And Sadie will be talking about medievalism in fashion. Sorry, I should have said history, women and gender studies double major.
All good. Hello, thank you all for being here.
Today for my presentation, I did something a little different. Normally I'm housed in modern Middle Eastern history, so that's obviously very different from, well, a lot of things. But specifically I wanted to talk about medievalism in fashion as a trend, rather than actual fashion in the Middle Ages, so I just want to give that really big disclaimer that they're very different things. And so there's a couple images here. The first is a pair of gloves. Those are actually from the Middle Ages. This is an image of a French film from the 60s with medieval revival. This is something I saw on Instagram. This girl posted that I know, and I was like, oh, medievalism. Just caught me off guard a little. And then these are from, I really love Betsy Johnson as a designer, but it's from her 1997, I don't remember if it's her spring or winter collab, but those are my two favorite looks. Obviously, is it historically accurate? No, but you know. So yeah, and then a disclaimer for the next image for those who are pure of heart. But I wanted to give the disclaimer. The reason I was really interested in medievalism and fashion today is that for my, so sorry, anyone who only views me as a scholar, you'll see my Halloween outfit. So I wore that, you know, to the club. And then everyone kept looking at me and they were like, you're Joan of Arc, right? And I was like, Joan of Arc wasn't showing cleavage in the clubs. I'm not Joan of Arc. Like, I don't know what you want to say. Anyways, and then the first girl, bless her heart, she was like, I was like, no, I'm a medievalist representation of a knight. And then she was like, what? And then I was like, yeah, I'm Joan of Arc. Because I gave up, I don't know. Thankfully, my friends I went with are also, well, one isn't history major, but the other one is a history major. So she understood what I meant. Yeah, so that's why I came to this topic. But first, I want to show you guys some actual garments from the Middle Ages, sort of to get us started. So both of these, or all of these images, as well as the gloves I showed in the first one, are from a book by Elizabeth Coatsworth and then Gail Owen Crocker called Clothing of the Past, Surviving Garments from the Early Medieval to Modern Western Europe from 2017. I really liked the book just visually because it showed us different garments. And as I said, like, the actual fashion in the Middle Ages would be a very different presentation, but we can understand medievalism as a play on medieval itself, a periodization, often used by scholars. It has different dates, depending on who you ask. But medievalism, and this was according to Wikipedia, I was just very interested in what they thought medievalism was. They defined it as a system of beliefs and practice inspired by the Middle Ages of Europe or by devotion to elements of that period, which have been expressed in areas such as, architecture, literature, music, etc. I just thought that was an interesting definition because by devotion to elements of that period, I was like, what does that mean? Which is an often, I don't know, I would say that in general for most medievalist interpretations, very loose. So I have a couple garments. These were just my favorites I saw. The first is headgear in general. Coming from art, the evidence is that headgear was worn by both sexes, indoors and outside, at dinners, in church, and even in bed. And this is understandable if we think about the fact they didn't have heating like we do today. You probably want something on your head. And so here it's the barrette of Prince Ferdinando de la Serra, who's the son of Alfonso X, from 1275. I really liked it because of the beading and the details on the lion. I just thought it was cool. And then the next item in the middle is an example of, not the medieval in general, like in the Middle Ages, you would layer a lot. And so it was for layering, it was for women, and it wasn't the first garment, but it was probably still like an inner garment, not the outer one. And so this is from Greenland, and it's a gown with short sleeves from 1434, made of local wool. And then for the last one, I really like this one, because again, the images I thought was interesting. This is, I apologize to anyone who can speak this language, but Gross Demolic from Vienna, Austria, and it's from 1260. So yes, we're now teleporting ourselves to the modern period. Where does medievalism come from? In part, at least in modern depictions, we can look at the 60s and the 70s and the kitschy revival of the Middle Ages in architecture first. In the 50s, these include cultural touchstones and images associated with the Middle Ages, whether or not they are historically accurate. And this was done in the context of the 50s and the economic boom. So they built more, and then this expansion of medievalism continued with hippie or countercultural uses in the 60s. And so these two images are from Eric Romner's, he's a French filmer or director, or they're the same film, my bad, but it's Persepolis Gallos, and so you can see it's set in the medieval, but in general a lot of movies from the 20th century were set in medieval times. So I just like those images because you can see often medieval interpretations are interwoven with fantasy. I think probably the most famous example from the 20th century, depending on who you ask, would be Lord of the Rings. Like, it's fantasy, it's not real. But in general, that's the starting of medievalism in modern fashion. And then here are a couple runway shows from the 90s and 2000s that sort of pushed medievalism into high fashion. The first, my favorite, Betsy Johnson in Winter 1997 was the first, they were on like the title slide. The first one I wanted to talk about was Jean-Paul Gaultier, or I don't know how to speak French, so I apologize for his last name. His show is really interesting because he combined medievalism with Indian elements, which I thought was interesting. He's using them both as like an exotic play for fashion. And in general, like a lot of his designs, I will say, are very culturally appropriating. But that's just fashion. I don't so much of high fashion does that, so I don't know. But I thought it was really interesting that it's both medieval in Europe, that's exotic, and like physically somewhere else. It also speaks to how we think about time. The next one is Anna Sui, her fall line. There's medieval. A lot of times, like medievalist fashion is just like the fabrics very much emphasized. You can see the fur trim. And then the last one is Alexander McQueen. His collection was a little more interesting to me just because it's not just high fashion, in theory, high fashion of some idea of the Middle Ages, but he had a lot of more like peasant-inspired looks for medieval interpretations, which I thought was really interesting. But also then it's like on a runway and like, I don't know like how much any of these would cost now, but like it's peasant-inspired, but like, I don't know, like a shred of that garment is probably like worth like thousands of dollars, so whatever that is. But in general, that's high fashion. And so today, why is medievalism trending? These were just my ideas. Obviously, these are open for interpretation. But the first detail I wanted to point out is that what medievalism allows people to do is that it's an attraction and desire for handmade artisan garments and styles rather than the fast fashion norms we see, even though medieval-inspired items can be produced in fast fashion. But a lot of them point to the fact that it would need to be handmade by someone. And so these are shoes from Prada's winter collection, but something I thought was really interesting is that they left the leather seam on it rather than most seams on shoes, like the leather are like in the inside, but they wanted to show it to show that it had to be handmade and it wasn't fast fashion produced, which I thought was really interesting. The second reason is just that it's trendy. I don't know, people follow the trends. And then the last one I'll say in general is the performance and uniqueness of fashion in general, and that fantasy and myth have always been forms of an expression, but often fantasy and myth is associated with the medieval. Again, obviously not historically accurate most of the time. And so these are examples of modern medieval core. Sorry, I don't like saying medieval core, like whatever core, but I kind of had to. And so this is from one of my favorite artists. She's Catholic Guilt, but she does a lot of chainmailing, and I just thought it was very beautiful, her like use of chainmailing and then like the raw exposed stones. These are just all from my Pinterest, so, because I was like, oh, medieval, but you can see like there's so many interpretations of it, and so in general, modern understandings of what medieval fashion would be emphasis on fur, chainmail, velvet, linen, and then shapes, a lot of head covering, and then also layering with corsetting, and then medieval accessories, whether or not it's historically accurate. But in general, I don't know, I have fun looking at all this because there's a strong difference between what people actually wore in the Middle Ages and then medievalism as a trend and then what people think from that. We'll see how the trend evolves, who knows, but that was my presentation.
so much to all of our speakers. This was such a great range of topics and so interesting. I'm always impressed by the kind of research that you guys are able to do. So for our Q&A period, as I said, I'd like to split up the room a little bit so that everyone gets a chance to have more of a one-on-one conversation with our speakers. So we're going to shuffle a little bit. Apologies for making me stand up. But what I would like to do is have, I'm just going in the order that people presented. I'm going to have Zoe over here, Tung on kind of the middle, basically right where you are right now, Carter in the back, Emily over in this kind of middle corner, and Sadie over here. And if you are an audience member, please seek out a presentation, a presenter, sit around, chat with them for a little bit. We can shuffle after a few minutes so that people get a chance to talk to the presenter. And please give them feedback, ideas, ask questions, and yes, your appreciation again for this fantastic work. All right, please disperse.
Thank you everyone for being here.
Yes.
The audience is present.